My name is Madupa Akinola, and I'm the director of the Bernstein Center for Leadership and Ethics. And so welcome to the Bernstein Center's Research Zoomposium. Oh, the new words we're all coming up with: Zoomposium, Zoom-B, whatever. Any new ones, put them in the chat, because sometimes that can be fun. We are so excited that we can do this in this virtual setting and have wonderful researchers share their research on leadership that comes out of the center. And out of the center's key topics that we focus on: values-based leadership, CSR, governance, business ethics, organizational culture, and so much more. And the researchers you'll hear from are not just any type of researcher, they're award-winning researchers. That is, they have received research grants from the Bernstein Center because we fund projects that are in line with the key mission of the center, which is to provide current and future business leaders with the tools and the frameworks that are key in terms of leading socially responsible organizations, making sure they're inclusive, and being inspiring leaders that allow everyone to thrive. So what you're going to see today are 7 outstanding research presentations, again by award-winning scholars. And we're doing this like mini TED Talks. So each presenter will get 6 minutes where they'll speak, and there'll be 2 minutes of Q&A following. And to streamline this and make sure we get through everything, we're going to ask you to direct your questions to the chat box, and then our team will monitor it throughout the rest of the event. So it is my honor and privilege to welcome our first speaker, Yegor Chichenko, who's a PhD student in the marketing division, and his research is entitled "Toward an Ethical Clearinghouse: Scalable Ranking Under Ethical Constraints." Take it away, Yegor.
Yegor, you're on mute.
Fantastic, thank you for letting me know. Yeah, thank you so much for this kind presentation. This is joint work with Wasim Dawadi, who is from ETH Zurich, and Kamel Jadidi, who is professor here at Columbia, and I'm a PhD student from marketing department. So let's get started. So our work deals with issues and decision problems which can be cast in the framework of ranking. So to give you a very simple example, it's the admission problem. Consider a business school that would like to admit students. And for simplicity, consider that it received just 6 applications, and it wants to admit, and it can only admit 4 people. So the top objective for the business school here in this simplified example is to maximize GMAT score. So it wants to maximize the average or total GMAT score across the admits. However, it has a requirement. It has a diversity score constraint. It wants to ensure that the total diversity score of admitted students is at least 3. And if you look at this current allocation, if you just admit people, top 4 people by GMAT, this constraint will be violated because here total diversity constraint is just 2. So how could we correct this situation? Well, a simple way would be to admit person 5 instead of person 4 in the ranking. This way we can see that the total diversity constraint is satisfied in the top 4 admits, and we can satisfy this constraint by minimally losing out on our primary objective, which is the GMAT score. Of course, this is a simplified example, and here we could just solve it by looking at these numbers and figuring out the solution. In real life situations, this problem can be much more complicated when you have many more constraints and much more complicated setups. Furthermore, you may have to solve it very fast. Another thing I would like to highlight here is that whenever you have a primary objective and a constraint, in all other than the most trivial cases, there is an inherent trade-off in tension. So our work looks at this tension and the issues it may cause, and also at how can we solve such types of problems really fast on real-life scale. So to motivate this, I think I will bring up 2 issues that partly are in the news. So one is the recent legal action against universities like Harvard and Yale, accusing universities of penalizing some of the racial groups in their admission process. For example, when it comes to Asian Americans in particular. And the point of this is not like whether they're actually doing this or not, but to highlight that there is some kind of lack of transparency in how these decisions are really made to allow for the rise of suspicion and potential ethical and legal claims against these institutions. So part of our work is looking at such issues. Another aspect of the problem actually comes about in very different settings. We can also cast in the framework of ranking such problems as recommending items or content to viewers, be it on Netflix or TikTok or your favorite app. And in these settings, we also observe some consternation with how the decisions are made and some concerns about the quality. So for example, here, this is a blog post that highlights issues. It's from a few years ago, but it highlighted issues with Netflix recommender system. You know, when you as a person of color come for the first time to Netflix, the content used to be mostly white, so it didn't reflect diversity. But after the same time as Netflix acquired information about you and maybe inferred that you may belong to a racial minority, suddenly all your content became focused just on that racial minority, which highlighted lack of diversity. And this is a real concern raised by individual viewers. So motivated by these two examples, we can view two problems that exist right now. First, there seems to be an inherent conflict of interest between the decision maker's primary objective in the settings and the ethical considerations. When there is a lack of transparency, it enables the possibility of little to no accountability. And that creates a potential for legal and ethical challenges. And the second issue is that the existing algorithms proposed for solving such problems tend to be computationally inefficient. And if you want to deploy them on scale of Netflix or TikTok, where you have to provide rankings very fast in real time, then their usefulness is limited. So to address these two problems, we propose for the first problem, we propose the framework of ethical clearinghouse. In this framework, a decision maker can submit his preferences over considered items or individuals and their description to an independent body. That body can be set up as an oversight board independently inside the company, or can be set up on a national level. That board accepting these preferences and also using established fairness and diversity constraints, for example, as provided by the government or public opinion or some interinstitutional organizations, can modify this ranking so that it becomes compliant with such ethical constraints and return this clean ranking to the decision maker. Furthermore, it can add essentially a certificate of ethicality and legality. If a decision maker uses this recommended ranking in the decision making, then it's like a reputation shield. It's under some assumptions, it can be immunity against legal and ethical claims. Furthermore, there can be useful information extracted, like shadow price information for constraint violation, to inform policy debate around, for example, Pigouvian taxes or subsidies to encourage compliance. We also, I will not cover this slide in too much detail, but we also propose a scalable algorithm for resolving such ranking under constraints problems fast using statistical sampling. So we experiment with a few data sets with movies. I'll skip this for now. And we elucidate different trade-offs. Essentially, what we see when we experiment with all this algorithm is that there is an inherent trade-off between the computation time, the ability to comply with ethical constraints, and ability to maximize the decision maker's objective. And we elucidate how different methods, which methods are most essentially Pareto optimal. So here are a few things cool about this project, but I'll stop here. Thank you so much for your attention.
So Yegor, you have a couple of questions in the chat box, specifically related to the diversity score. So the first question is, what does a diversity score of 1 or 2 mean? So I think that goes back to your first slide. And then the second question is, could a diversity score also be relative to the admitted pool or the pool of existing students instead of absolute?
Yes, so thank you very much for the question. So for diversity score, our framework is agnostic to specific criteria that you want to use in terms of ethics. It can be anything, whichever diversity type you care about, it's up to you to determine it. So it's completely flexible that way. We are not trying to impose a particular view of ethics. Could be relative to the admitted pool or pool of existing students. Yes, I think basically this framework allows to accommodate flexible fairness constraints, and I think a variety of them can be accommodated. Okay, thank you.
Okay, and then why or why not admit the 710 candidate over the 730 candidate?
I will need to take a look at that again, but I believe the main issue is the amount of loss in GMAT, because we want to satisfy our ethical constraint while minimally losing out on GMAT score. And I think the solution that I have there allows for that.
And then
it also can be non-unique in some cases, so it's another possibility.
Perfect. And then one last question. How is the ethical integrity of the clearinghouse, how can that be guaranteed? And what measures would be in place to prevent them to become subject to the same ethical ranking constraints?
Yes, I think the main recipe should be complete transparency. You know, we already have experience with such institutions. For example, we have IRB board inside universities. You know, Facebook recently set up an oversight board with mixed success maybe. There are also, for example, for medical residences, there are systems that match students to schools. So we have experience, and I think the practice has proven that these institutions can operate well.
Perfect. Thank you so much. We truly appreciate your time.
Thank you.
And now it is my pleasure to go ahead and welcome Professor Mabel Abraham from the Management Division, who will be presenting her research that she did with Jenna Song, a PhD student on gender inequality in the workplace. Take it away, Mabel.
Thanks, Olivia. Can everyone see the slides? That's perfect. So yes, I'm very excited to have the opportunity to share what turns out to be a very short summary of the research that we've been working on, specifically looking at how organizational self-diagnoses affect change in gender inequality within the organization. So to set us up here and sort of think about the framework we have in mind, the graphic that I'm showing is not one that surprises most of us. It essentially is showing the relative pay women receive on average vis-a-vis men. So there are so many different drivers for this type of inequality, most recently estimated at about 81 cents on the dollar. The different drivers range from things like women being evaluated differently than men, both in being promoted and in getting performance reviews. And one of the key drivers here is that women often are in just different jobs than men are overall, right? So that comes from women applying for different jobs, pursuing different fields, as well as bias and inequality in the hiring process, where they're potentially disadvantaged for jobs that have historically been held by men. So for all those different factors, we see this level of inequality on average. But a really important thing to keep in mind is that this is not uniform across organizations. So here I'm just highlighting one stylized example of Salesforce. So Mark Benioff, when he found out that Salesforce had pay inequality, he set out to do something about it, right? So there's lots of articles. He now has this book where he's basically trying to take steps to redress the inequality. And the company has invested nearly $9 million in doing so. What they realize is that in order to equalize pay so that men and women in the same jobs were paid equally, they needed to increase pay for a large proportion of their female employees. And they did so in multiple waves amounting to about $9 million. So this fact, the variation that we see across organizations, where some firms have much more inequality and other firms have less, really served as the motivation for the study. So in this study, what we want to understand is how can we better identify which organizations are likely to make improvement to actually help to redress this inequality. We know that there's variance, there's some sort of examples and illustrations of this, but we don't really know how we predict which firms are going to be able to do this better than others. So the research question we're asking here is exactly to that end. It turns out it's really hard to identify appropriate data to ask this type of question, because essentially what we need to be able to observe is level of inequality over time, as well as indicators at the organizational level that give us some traction in explaining or identifying, predicting that inequality. So in this study, we're leveraging the UK's 2017 Equality Act, where they're focused on gender pay inequality. And specifically what the mandate asks is that every company with 250 employees or more has to report multiple dimensions of pay inequality, specifically showing what proportion do women earn relative to men in terms of base pay and bonus pay. In addition to this required component, firms are also encouraged, or it's recommended, that they include a supporting narrative that explains the current gap, potentially outlines what the company plans to do about it. They have lots of latitude, both in terms of whether they submit this information and if they do, what they include in these documents. So in going through these documents, what we realized is that there was huge variation. Many companies didn't do it at all. And those that did ranged from a paragraph or two, just with a statement about what the gap was resulting from or what they were currently doing in terms of policies and practices, whereas other companies had 15-page documents with illustrations and graphics and additional data. So we leveraged these reports, these narratives, to really try to understand, A, whether just submitting a narrative report, whether engaging in this voluntary action of writing the report, writing this narrative, predicts their ability to actually improve over time. And beyond that, the sort of deeper dive that we do with this data is understanding the content of the report. And are there certain features of the type of narrative that the organization is engaging in that helps us understand whether or not they improve over time? So this is really where the funding that we received from Bernstein came in. So I'm going to take just a moment to tell you what we did in terms of our data process. So the first piece was easy, right? Our dependent variable, the thing we're explaining is this gender pay gap. Companies are reporting this year over year. It's quantitative data that we could just access through the UK's website. Narrative reports, on the other hand, were qualitatively coded, meaning that it started off with Jenna and I working together to come up with a code book of how we wanted to code each of these reports, finding things like what kinds of commitments are they making? What kinds of policies and statements are they having in place already? And what are they claiming to do in the future? What kinds of attributions or sense making are they engaging in for why they have the gap in the first place? So we started with that process. We then had to hire a team of master's students who had experience with qualitative coding to hand code 1,000 of these reports. And our last step, the piece that we're currently working on now, is having a machine learning, developing a machine learning algorithm to use this qualitative coding to apply those codes to the remaining 5,000 reports. So we're just finishing up that tail end of the process, but it's been a laborious and expensive process. We really just want to stress how helpful it was to have the funding from Bernstein. So I'm going to share a couple of preliminary findings. As I mentioned, we're still in the process of finalizing these machine learning algorithms and finalizing our data. But a couple of interesting things are coming up from the data already. So the first is that, contrary to what we expected, the simple act of submitting this report, of engaging in the writing of this narrative, does not predict a company's reduction of the gap. So it's no more likely that a company who writes a report reduces their pay inequality from 2017 to 2 years later in 2019 than if they hadn't written a report at all. Similarly, we also coded things like how much they invested in the report, how long is it, how many different unique components were included. None of those factors seem to be predictive of their change from 17 to 19. The thing that's really standing out as being the most predictive of the likelihood that they improve is actually whether or not they engage in what we're calling the self-diagnosis process. So for organizations that actually engage in an understanding of what is leading to their gap, specifically and most commonly when they're pointing to the absence of women in top organizational positions, the fact that women tend to be in lower ranking positions, if they engage in that sense-making process and make that attribution, we find that they're significantly more likely to reduce the gap over that 2-year period than if they don't. Again, all things held equal, even if we're comparing similar organizations engaging in other elements of the report similarly. This was really interesting to us because very often what we think about is that organizations are going to make change if they have policies and programs in place. So the first thing we thought about is we have to really account for what kinds of policies are they claiming to engage in. So the effect that we're finding is a net of the actual policies that they're engaging in. So above and beyond having certain programs, simply engaging in this attribution process is really important for understanding whether they make improvement over time. So with that, I'm going to stop and just reiterate again that we really appreciate the support that we received from Bernstein. I'm happy to answer any questions in the remaining time that we have.
So we have about a minute for questions. None came through the chat box, but does anybody would like to raise their hand to ask a quick question? We have about a minute left. Okay. So Mabel, my one question for you is, where do you take this research from here?
So we're at the stage where we're hoping to have the final or the first sort of complete draft of the paper over the next couple of months, month or two. And our goal is to submit it to a sociology outlet. And then from there, think about practical implications and sort of what we can extrapolate from the findings of the study as well.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. We appreciate your time today. And next up, we'll be moving right along. We will have Cheyenne Dashmis, from the Finance Division, a PhD student who will be presenting on his research project, Concavified Contracts and Managerial Risk-Taking. Take it away. I think you're on mute.
Hello, everyone. Yeah, sorry. I'm gonna today I'm gonna present my work as a joint work on options and volatility. So I'm very thankful to the financial support from Stanford Bernstein Center. So let me start with some motivations. Consider a European option that is given to you. A very basic question is the price of this option increasing with volatility or not? So we all know from finance classes that if you have a conventional European call option, the answer is yes. But if you have another very simple structure like a binary call option, the answer is no. And that's a bit contrary to common intuition. So people usually think that if you have a binary option, then increasing volatility will result to a higher probability of ending in the money, so you will have an increasing price with volatility, but that's not true. Also, another related strand of literature in finance is about the managerial compensation. So managers can affect the firm's performance. They can gain expected return and volatility. If I want to summarize the executive compensation theories, there are two main pillars. The ancient and the older view is rent extraction view, which is the managers can choose their compensation to maximize their rents. But the more modern view is shareholder view, which is the board of directors, they can design some compensation scheme so that they incentivize the manager. So the two main questions that I'm trying to answer in this research is, first of all, what is the effect of volatility on option prices, European, American, real options? And the second one is try to incorporate those insights to a managerial compensation framework. So Edmonds and Gabay have an interesting survey of managerial compensation that they emphasize that this work hasn't been done that much, that if a manager can change the risk and return at the same time, then what would be the optimal compensation? So there is an early work done by Green in 1984, which he notes a notion of a concavified call. So where you have a call option and then you concavify the tail of the option, and then he uses a notion of warrants that leads to these sort of options. So I'm gonna build on these literature. So I have a theorem. Suppose you have a very arbitrary option given to you. The payoff of your option is a sum of some coefficients times some conventional European call. So it's a finite combination of calls. So the question is the price of this claim increasing with sigma when sigma is sufficiently high, or it's not increasing? And the answer is, if you look at this expression, the sum of alpha I times the square root of ki, so it's the determinants of this behavior. For example, here I have a graph of different concavified calls. From top to bottom, the degree of concavification changes. So you see that in the yellow curve, the option price is starting to be non-increasing with volatility. And if the degree of concavification is more, you see that the price is very non-increasing. So it increases and it decreases to zero. So and then I do this exercise for Arrow-Debreu prices. So Arrow-Debreu price is a claim on a particular given state of the world. So if, for example, Apple's stock is 200, how much are you gonna pay if I pay you $1 if Apple stock is exactly equal to 200? So these Arrow-Debreu prices are also behaving non-monotonically with volatility. So for example, if you take one particular Arrow-Debreu price and plot it against the volatility, you see that it first increases and then it decreases. So let me put all of this in a very simple model of managerial compensation. So suppose you have a value, the firm's value given to you by this exogenous expression. So beta times the mu minus alpha times the deviation from an optimal sigma. So sigma star here is the value that is maximizing the firm's value. So we want to ideally induce the manager to choose sigma star. If you give the managers a call option, then the manager would choose sigma equal to infinity, and you will not get the maximized value for the firm. But you can optimally implement the optimal contract using a concavified call with a proper degree of concavification. So that's a very basic insight, that concavification helps you to induce the manager to choose the optimal level of volatility. So the ongoing work here is that how to write this in a formalized model of managerial compensation, and how to look at the effect of volatility on other class of option prices. Thank you so much.
Okay, so you have one question that came in through the chat box. How realistic are the parameters to the option will lead to an inverse relation in volatility and price?
Sorry, let me bring the, can you say again?
Yeah, how realistic are the parameters to the option? How realistic is it that the parameters to the option will lead to an inverse relation in volatility and price?
How realistic that the parameters to the option will lead to an inverse relation in volatility and price? I don't understand the question. How realistic?
Professor Kuga, do you want to go off mute? We have about a minute.
So we did it pretty quickly. So forgive me. You had a figure which showed that most of the for the stylized simulations, or however you drew those lines for them, that when the price was at one, that was your purple one below. You had a green one there, which alpha, I think was alpha is your parameter there.
Yeah. So
alpha is less than 0. So how realistic that you will find that to be the sort of contract that should be written on a compensation?
So this value of A is realistic. I mean, if A is equal to half, it means you have a call, but you concavify it half the way through a flat line. So and then if your question is what are the range of the sigmas that are realistic, so the range of the sigmas that are realistic is from 0 to half, for example, and then it doesn't matter, because if you change the parameters of this concavified call, you can capture any value of sigma star. So I haven't put that theorem here. So the theorem is that if you change the parameters of this concavified call, you can pin down any value of sigma star that you want. So it doesn't matter, it's 0.1 or 1 or anything. Great, thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. We appreciate it. So moving right along, as you can tell, these TED-like talks go by very quickly. So please feel free during the presentations to drop any questions in the Q&A so we can keep moving. We are now going to move to Professor Wei Jiang from the Finance Division, and she will be presenting on her project, Women in the Boardroom, Why Does Change Come at a Glacial Pace? Thanks so much, Professor.
Thanks. Thanks for the support from Bernstein Center. This research will address the question, has the progress toward gender equity in the boardroom moving at the glacial pace, and if so, why? Let's first look at the reality. So the dotted line is the US, and this plots the time series of percentage of women on corporate boards, public and private firms. And as you can see that the US is in the middle pack of the developed world. Europe is overall ahead. And also, if you look at the change in the US, indeed, up to about 2016, there was this notion about a glacial pace came along. But in the last 2 years, you can clearly see that the uptick is if now it's a glacial pace in the global warming. So there is hope coming along. There has been quite a divergence between public firms and private firms. Public firms have been under much more scrutiny, and the progress is much faster, but the same progress in the private company world has been largely absent. So this is the reality. So let me talk to the main point of the paper. Now, how can you increase the diversity of the board? So even though this research is about gender diversity, but the basic logic and the mechanism would apply to any general notions of diversity. Now, any improvement in diversity can only come at the turnover of the board. If the board does not turn over, then nothing could be changed. And if you look at the left panel, you will see that the turnover in terms of departure, the gender is on par with the board, which is understandable. When people leave the board, it could become because of retirement, because of health reasons, personal reasons. There's no particular gender disparity over that. On the addition part, there's a quite significant upstick. So basically, the progress you have seen comes from the addition part. So in the most recent year, 2019, it has been about 1/3. So 1/3 of the new members added to the board in 2019 were women. That is a significant increase over the previous years. But that change over the par level of the board only happened after the financial crisis was over. So that's why the progress seemingly has been low. Now, the important thing to point out is that when the board turnover is about 10%, then even if you're adding 25% of the women, so let's have a numerical exercise. If you're adding 25% of women to a board that's currently 20%, with the annual turnover about 9%, how long does it take for the current board gender representation to rise to halfway to 22.5%? The answer is 10 years. That's much longer than your intuition would direct you. So basically, when the turnover is low, no matter how aggressive you're putting more women on the board, on the margin, it still takes a long time for the current stock to change. And this reflects on extraordinarily long tenure of the board, as shown on the right panel. So you can see that comparing board members to CEOs, okay, so the percentage of CEOs that are being in a position for more than 10 years, it's about 6%. But over a quarter of the board members have been in the board seat for 10 years. Now, the percentage of CEOs in a position for 20 years almost does not exist. But however, about 5% of board members have been there for 20 years. And these extremely long tenured board directors are predominantly men, which regardless how you turn over the margin, the shift on the board diversity is relatively, the impact is low than people would have thought or would have hoped for. Now, how do we increase the board turnover? There is usually the chart I show you, this is a voluntary turnover. However, there's also a way to turn over the board much faster through external force. That's called a proxy contest. So in a proxy context, meaning both sides, the corporate incumbent part, the dissident part, each nominate their own candidates to the board. And the shareholders would have a choice to see whether they elect the board, the management slate, or the dissident slate. I show this chart that basically say, whenever there's a proxy context, there tend to be 2 additional new members who will be elected to the board. Because if you ask the management to come up with their own nominees, they tend to nominate themselves or the incumbents. So proxy context is a way to dramatically increase the board turnover. However, mostly it has been a wasted opportunity for increasing board diversity. So the reason is that when a proxy context happens, then on average, there are fewer women who come as a dissident candidates compared to a turnover that is not contested, just a normal election. Now, it's the key point of the papers come at the next slide, because when you look at this, it's very tempting to argue proxy context or shareholder activism is bad for gender diversity. The reason that they tend to lead to fewer new candidates who are female to be added to the board compared to a non-contested turnover. Now, the result is actually the opposite. So I called the losing the battle, winning the war. So on the first regression, forget about regression, it shows that the percent of women added to the board is 3 percentage points lower when there's a proxy context relative to a non-contested election. Now, on the right regression actually show the presence of the proxy context actually increases the representation of women on the board. Why? Because it dramatically increases the turnover. So here's a situation. They increase the turnover of the board, but condition on the turnover, they elect fewer women onto the board. When you multiply by the two products, they will still lead to more women to be pushed into the boardroom. So this is what I want to emphasize as the key message, that the key is for gender diversity is to increase turnover, in addition to having more women to be on the nominees. So I'll just stop here. I think my time is over. Thanks for the support.
Okay, perfect. So you have one question in the chat. What are the implications for gender and racial diversity in academia where tenure leads to low turnover?
That's actually precisely, it's the way I motivate the research. Whenever you have extremely long tenure, it's very, very difficult to increase diversity in a short period of time. That's in fact, I think that question exactly hit on the point.
Perfect. And Professor Faroknia, please feel free to take yourself off mute to ask your question.
Thank you. Hi, Wei. Thanks for the presentation. Yeah. 2 quick questions. I was intrigued by your chart showing the difference between Europe and the US, specifically also Europe versus UK. Based on some numbers I know, in Germany and UK women representation is not that high. So I was just wondering if there's any specific country in Europe you've seen they have good practices such that it would bump the average in the Europe higher. And also in regard to, I was intrigued by your thoughts around proxy voting and contests. We know that there are firms like Depository Trust and State Street that vote on behalf of large institutional owners, and sometimes they just go by default. Any instances you have seen that there is a regulation or some mandate forcing such institutions to vote in scenarios like that and take into account diversity or not?
Yeah. So I think in Europe, the Northern European countries, the Nordic countries are ahead of the Western and the Southern Europe. And regarding the mechanism, I actually think there should be a term limit of the board directors, just like most of the other jobs. And in fact, I would encourage the large institutions to vote for the candidates to replace the long tenured candidates, rather than just simply vote based on gender or race. Because as long as you embrace the new pool of candidates, they're naturally more diverse. I think that's the key message I want to get out of this research.
Okay, great. All right. Thank you so much, Professor. We appreciate your time and this excellent research. All right. At this time, I am pleased to welcome Fabrizio Delacroix, who is a PhD in the Management Division. He'll be presenting his research that is co-sponsored by Patrick Perkowski and Professor Bruce Kogut on the effects of automation in team performance. Take it away.
Thank you, Olivia, and thank you to the Bernstein Center. We're very excited to present our research about using a Super Mario video game to studying the effects of automation. Bruce Kogut and Patrick Perkowski are also on this call in case there's very, very many questions in the chat, or I can answer the questions at the end in the Q&A. So in recent years, many have pointed to the amazing developments in the field of artificial intelligence. And many have claimed we'll soon be approaching the age of AI. And the idea is that AI will be substituting what humans do. So AI can either help us or take our jobs, but they will do things better than humans. And this discussion has mostly ignored what happens when we introduce AI inside organizations and let it collaborate together with humans. So how does AI affect the performance of teams? How does it affect team coordination, the trust, and the effort that team members exert? These questions, of course, are difficult to answer because they're especially difficult to measure. So what we do in this experiment is to run an experiment in the lab and study the introduction of AI in a team where AI collaborates with humans. They play a game that requires team-based communication and coordination. We bring 235 subjects in the lab. We have them playing this game, and then we randomly assign some teams to play together with an AI and some teams to just stick with a human-only team. The game they're playing is Dash and Dine in Super Mario Party. This is a coordination-based game, so it's perfect to study team effects. There are 4 players playing the game. And so there's 2 players on the left that are working together, and 2 players on the right that are working together. They are collecting ingredients for recipes, so tomato, lettuce, and bacon, and they have 1 minute for each round. They move around the screen, and they try to collect these ingredients to complete the recipes as fast as possible without interfering one with the other. And the nice thing about this game is that we can introduce a simple automated agent that collaborates with the humans. And additionally, another interesting feature is that we can observe everything that happens in this game. So we can directly look at what players do when they play, in particular, whether they manage to coordinate between themselves or not. So this actual gameplay video that I'm going to show you, you see that Mario, who's on the left, needs to get the lettuce in the bottom right. Peach and Luigi want to go in the opposite direction, and they need to coordinate and cross to avoid bumping into one another and waste their time. So we see Mario is going to the right, and then Peach is there, and then Luigi is there. And so they fail to coordinate properly. Mario does not manage to get the lettuce yet. And this leads the organization to lose 8 seconds as they try to get their ingredients and bring them back to the table. So we study what happens when we introduce AI in this game. You see the red line is the moment where we introduce AI. And from that moment on, if we look at the blue dots, we see there is a negative performance effect of introducing AI. So although AI is a very good player and we should expect a positive effect, we see the number of ingredients that the teams collect goes down. At the same time, these teams fail to coordinate more and more often. So we see an increase in the coordination failures of the teams. We also asked the humans to complete a survey at the end. And in particular, we focus on how much they trusted their partner and how much effort they put into playing the game, if they were playing with AI or with other human members. And we see that humans trust their AI partner less than other human members. And also, very interestingly, that they exert less effort themselves in playing their own game. So previous work had shown that when people play with other humans, good human players, they exert more effort. When playing with AI, they actually exert less effort. So in conclusion, much of this debate about AI is about what automation can do. And we think we need to move a little bit beyond that and not view tasks only in isolation. We know that teams matter for humans, they matter also for machines, and automation affects team performance, team coordination in these human AI teams. So when we introduce machines, we should think a bit more broadly about the effects on the whole organization. So the impacts on the humans that are playing with the AI, more broadly, the organizational culture, maybe how to design teams that have automated agents in them. And a lot of this debate is really about which are the human workers that are substituted. We see here that it's very important also which human workers stay in the organization and collaborate with AI, because there are important differences between them. And this allows to move a little bit beyond this AI determinism that we often hear. So what organizations we build, who exactly is substituted. These decisions are very important. They're made by organizations, and they will have an impact on how the future of work and also the future more broadly will look like. Thank you.
Perfect. In the chat, a lot of people are asking about the intensive testing that probably had happened before this research was put into place. So I think a lot of people are a little jealous about the game playing, but we don't have any questions as of yet. Oh, here we go. Did you train AI with AI in the game first?
No. So this AI was embedded in the game already. So that's one of the advantages of using this game. We use the best AI available in the game, and that's why, on average, the AI performs better than the human players when it performs by itself. But then introducing this good AI into the human teams actually decreases the performance of the team. So that's one of the interesting dynamics. But the AI itself was developed within the game.
Okay, and then the next question. Did you test again after training the humans to work with AI?
Not afterwards, no. But what we see, so we have them playing a number of rounds. And what we see is that there is a very strong effect at the beginning, a negative effect of introducing AI and an increase in coordination failure, so a decrease in coordination. And then over time, humans learn to play with AI. And by the last rounds, we see this effect becomes very negligible. So it's really a disruption that happens after humans have played a little bit together. Then we disrupt them, and then they adapt.
Okay, great. All right.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Fabrizio. That was really intriguing. And so moving along, we are now pleased to welcome Professor Christian Moser from the Economics Division, and he will be presenting on his research project, The Value of Leadership and Workplace Attributes in the Labor Market. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. My name is Chris Moser, and I am an assistant professor in the Economics Division here at CBS. Today, I want to talk about this research project of mine, which is under the title, The Value of Leadership and Workplace Attributes in the Labor Market. And this project has been kindly sponsored by the Bernstein Center at CBS, for whose support I'm very grateful, and the project probably wouldn't be in the current state without that support. So thank you very much for that. Let me give you like a little bit of an overview of the project. In this research piece, we asked the simple, but I think fundamental and important question of what constitutes a good job. And you may not be surprised that among economists, the traditional view is that a good job is simply a high-paying job. Now, along these lines, a large literature in economics has been concerned with measuring, wage differences both in the cross-section, between people, and also over time, how wage inequality has evolved. You probably have heard about these trends in inequality, usually upward trends in inequality in places like the US, in Germany, and many other countries. But anecdotally, it might also seem obvious to you, pay is not everything. And I would prompt you here to maybe ask one of our MBA students about what makes a good job to them, and whether pay is everything. I posit that they'll tell you that no, pay is not everything. They choose their careers, be it marketing or consulting or investment banking or whatever it may be, also based on pay, but as well based on other considerations. Now, in this project, we want to take a broader view of what constitutes a good job, and we'll then develop a methodology that allows us to measure the perceived value of jobs as perceived by the workers that are choosing between these jobs. We'll apply this method to what I think is a particularly important topic, namely the gender pay gap. And then we'll use this to study the sources as well as the consequences of gender gaps in one particular context, that is in Brazil. Now, before we go into more of the details, I want to tell you how we conceptualize the value of a job. Simply put, we think of the total value that a job or that an employer offers as the sum of two terms. That is, how much it pays, and then the total of all the other non-pay attributes of this job. Now, this is almost tautological because these two are mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive, so-called MISI. But it does take a stance on pay and non-pay being additive, that they come together in an additive way. Now, with this in mind, the challenge, of course, now is that we do not directly observe the value of a job. We may be able to observe pay, but it may be much harder to observe non-pay attributes or the value of these non-pay attributes of a particular job or at a particular employer. And so in order for us to measure the perceived job value that includes pay and non-pay, what we do is we follow a so-called reveal preference approach. Very simply put, we follow people's choices. Now, formally, what we're doing in this project is we're applying a variant of Google's PageRank algorithm. That is the algorithm that Google, the search engine, uses literally in order to rank websites on the internet. And we're going to apply that to a network, not of websites, but a network of employers or firms, jobs in the economy. The intuition of this measure of this PageRank is very simple. On the web, a website will be highly ranked if it gets a lot of clicks from other highly ranked websites and doesn't link to random websites. In our context, a job, an employer, will be highly ranked if it attracts a lot of workers from other highly ranked jobs and doesn't lose a lot of workers to other low-ranked jobs. So simply put, this PageRank is then a proxy of the employer value rank. And from this, we're able to recover the value of non-pay attributes. Simply because we know the rank of a job now, we know how much it pays. You can observe that in many data sets. We're now able to invert this equation and back out the non-pay component of this particular job or of this employer in the network of all the jobs. Now, the application of this particular method for us will be to study the gender pay gap. And the way that we will do this is we will construct page ranks of employers or jobs in the economy separately by gender. The assumption here is that for both men as well as for women separately, the value of a given job or an employer has pay and non-pay attributes, but neither pay nor non-pay attributes of a given employer, say, must be the same between men and women. So there could be a firm that's very high paying and maybe also very attractive for men to work at, but maybe women don't fare so well and don't like the job as much as men do. Now, specifically, we're going to apply this method to gender using large-scale administrative employment records from Brazil that contains approximately 350 million jobs of roughly 500,000 employers in that economy. And as a result of applying our method, what we are able to estimate here will be a distribution of, well, pay on the one hand, but also of non-pay values of every single employer in this economy, which is kind of amazing because now we see for this 500,000 firms, we see both how well they pay from our data that records wages at these firms. And our method contributes to that, how much non-pay, like money equivalent values, people attach implicitly to these different employers through their choices of how they move between these employers. Now, just to give you a sense of what some of these results look like, here in this graph, I'm showing you on the left the dispersion of female pay conditional on male pay at a given firm. The key takeaway here being that the two are strongly related, but there's quite a bit of dispersion, especially in the middle of the distribution. So there are some median paying firms for men around, say, the 50th percentile of male pay that are paying quite generously, highly for women, or quite low wages for women at the same time. So there's lots of heterogeneity between gender within an employer group in pay. But if you look at the right panel, if anything, there's even more heterogeneity in ranks. That is how people evaluate the total value of a job between men and women for the same employer group. Now, what our estimates allow us to do is they allow us to shed light on what are the deeper determinants of amenities at a job that men and maybe women value differentially. And just to give you an idea, what we find is that women tend to like relatively more things like work hours flexibility, being able to change to part-time or full-time back and forth, more generous parental and sick leaves. Whereas men, on the other hand, seem to be, compared to women, relatively more risk-loving, in the sense that they do not mind as much risky jobs that are both higher accident or maybe higher earnings or employment fluctuations risks. Now, overall, through the lens of a fully blown structural economic model that I don't have time to spell out here, what we find is that out of a gender pay gap of 8.9% that we estimate on the data, we find that roughly 1/5 of it is due to the fact that women prefer slightly lower paying but high amenity value jobs. For example, those that offer higher parental leave generosity, which men do not value as much as women do. Now, the remaining 4/5 of the gender pay gap is due to what we find to be gender-specific labor market barriers. And these may well include different forms of labor market discrimination. Now, associated with the above, our results or our analysis suggest that unequal treatment and preferences of women versus men account for up to 3.5% of output as well as welfare losses in the economy, which we think of as significant. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you again for Bernstein for supporting this research project.
Thank you so much, Professor Moser. We appreciate it. At this moment, does anybody have any Q&A? Please feel free to raise your hand and you can go ahead and ask directly. Okay.
May I ask a quick question? Sorry.
Yes, absolutely. Please.
Find my raised hand. It was hidden. Chris, quick question. The distinction, you did this in Brazil, the distinction between white collar, blue collar. Any comment on that in regard to the survey and all?
Yeah, so occupational differences matter tremendously. You know, in Brazil, like we know for the US and other countries, we study them as part of this project. Something that we find is that the type of job is somewhat less associated with the relative value of a job for men versus women. So the occupational diversity does not seem to be the dominant driver behind these gender differences, although they are important overall in explaining pay differences.
I see. Thank you.
And Professor, you have one more question in the chat box. What is the next phase of this research and what findings will you be building upon?
So something that I did not have time at all to show today, but that we've already started to work on and that we'll pursue further is we'd like to understand something related to what actually Wei Jiang was talking about, which is the role of policy that might promote gender equality and to what extent they are effective or not, given this new view of the labor market, namely one in which pay is not everything. And it turns out our preliminary results suggest that some policies can really backfire in such an environment. Think of an equal hiring mandate. Suppose that you need to hire a woman for every man, or you can apply this maybe to other contexts. If you have such an equal hiring mandate, but there is really an amenity difference or a workplace non-pay attribute difference between men and women that they perceive, they may not want the same jobs as men to begin with. At least to some extent, that may be true. And so the effectiveness of these policies might be quite different to a world where everyone agrees on what is a good job and that a good job is the one that pays a lot.
Perfect. And there's one last question. With things like paid paternity leave becoming more popular, do you see non-pay attributes becoming more important to men?
I think that's a great question. I see them becoming more important, I think, overall as an economy develops. That's more of a hypothesis right now. I don't have hard evidence for this, but it only seems natural to me that as we become more prosperous, that we are not seeking just more and more money, but also more life quality. Whether that will be differential for men to women, I'd hope so, in the spirit of seeking gender equality in the US, like in many other countries. Things are usually very one-sided. By the way, in Brazil as well, usually 98% of parental leaves are taken by women in Brazil. The numbers are not that dissimilar in the US. They're very different in places like Sweden and in Denmark, for example, and even in Germany to some extent. So I think there's like room to move, and recent research, not mine, but others suggest that that's an important margin that we need to go down if we want to find something closer to gender parity.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Professor Moser. And last but certainly not least, we are excited to end our research symposium today with Professor Dan Wong from the Management Division, and he will be presenting on his research project, Does Diversity Bolster Social Activism? Thanks again.
Thanks, Olivia, and thanks to Madupe and Shirley for organizing this event. Thanks to the Bernstein Center for sponsoring not just our research, but all of my colleagues' research as well. It's been a big boost to all of us. And it's wonderful to hear all these different opinions and to hear about what all of my colleagues are doing as well. And so I'll try to do my best and wrap up on a high note as well, given the example that everyone has set for me that has come before. I do want to acknowledge that this is a project that I've started not alone, but with the help of essential collaborators. I think the most important collaborator is Erica Bailey, who's a PhD student in our department in the management division. She's been essential in running a lot of the experiments that I'm going to be showing you, in addition to helping to develop the theory. And so she's been a wonderful collaborator to work on as she has led a lot of the initiative in this project. We're also working with Sarah Soul and Haigriva Rao, who are professors at Stanford at the business school there. And they've been really great in helping us with this project as long and linking us with a tradition of research that I hope to show you in this very brief talk. What I want to start with is simply the observation that the George Floyd and Black Lives Matter protests of not just 2020, but also 3 years ago and continuing today were historic. And they were historic for a number of reasons, but I want to point out 3 reasons. They were historic because they were large. The crowd counting project, which is housed at a variety of different universities, estimated that there were almost 26 million people who participated in protests just in the 1 week alone in June in 2020. And many more millions have since participated in Black Lives Matter movement protests throughout the summer and the fall. Another characteristic is that they were diverse. And so unlike a lot of protests that attract specific populations of individuals, other researchers have looked at the racial and gender composition of the Black Lives Matter movement protests this past summer and ongoing through the fall. And it just happens to be that they represent a remarkable cross-section of Americans, at least here in the United States and also abroad as well. And I think the other feature of the Black Lives Matter protests that I think are really interesting is that even though the objective of these protests were primarily to call out inequities associated with police brutality and other issues affecting Black Americans and Black people all around the world, what was fascinating is that the targets of protests aren't just state policies and governments, but also business as well. And that's going to become significant in terms of contextualizing this research within, why we're doing it here at CBS. But this point is also not that surprising, because based on some past work I've done, what I think is really interesting in terms of observing whom protesters target is that throughout the later 20th century, and this trend continues today, is that the proportion of protests that have targeted the state or the government, that is our elected officials, have gone down over time from about 70% of representative protests in the United States in 1965 to just 50% in 1995. Now, the trend is just the opposite for protests targeting firms or private businesses. And so these numbers go from about 11% of protests in 1965 to almost 30% of protests in 1995. And so combined together with the aspect that protests have been large and diverse, this calls to mind a different type of effectiveness for the protests that we've seen. And what was remarkable about the George Floyd protests in 2020 2020 is that they were also highly effective. And let me show you one piece of evidence why that's true. Just in the short time of that 1 week of protests in June in this past year, the outpouring of support totaled almost $90 million through bail funds. And this is not counting donations to other Black Lives Matter groups as well. And so they were highly effective in mobilizing resources. And so this naturally, I think, leads to the question, well, what makes protest movements effective in general? There's lots of reasons for this, but I'm going to give you one view of this. And that one view suggests that when we perceive movements as deserving, then that leads to their success. Let me be a bit more specific about what I mean. One way to think about a movement as being deserving is to think about whether they're worthy, whether they express unity, whether they are large in terms of numbers, and whether the supporters are committed. That is, it is costly for them to support a movement. Now, this is not my model. This actually comes from a legendary Columbia sociologist and political scientist named Charles Tilly. And this was a model that he spent his entire career working on. What makes a movement deserving? Now, if a movement has these four qualities, worthiness, unity, numbers, and commitment, you can think of this as their wonkness or wonk, as it were, then that leads them to become more successful. So what does success mean? Well, in the context of social movements, movements are successful when they gain attention, when they spread throughout a population, they get more supporters, when they're able to amass more resources, such as donations. And furthermore, when these different aspects then lead them to be able to change policy or some aspect of the society that we all live in. So in order for movements to become successful, they have to first become wonky. So how do we know what makes a movement wonky? Well, this is where our research comes into play. And what we're kind of interested in is the role of diversity in making movements be seen as wonky. And so what does I mean by diversity? Well, on the one hand, you can think of diversity in terms of the demographics of supporters that are seen as being part of a social movement. So you can have a social movement that attracts a very homogeneous type of identity or very diverse individuals along ethnic and racial lines or gender diversity as well. But there's another type of critical diversity as well, and that is in the type of issues that a social movement or a protest espouses. And so, for example, they can be seen as very specialized, championing only a very narrow set of issues, or they can be seen as very broad, incorporating a large number of issues. And so let me give an example of a few of these different categorizations. The Occupy Wall Street movement, for example, from a few years ago, incorporated a number of different issues related to the economy, and they also attracted a diverse set of supporters. The Women's Christian Temperance movement, which predated prohibition in the United States, attracted primarily women of a certain class, and they had one issue, which is to basically ban alcohol or to make it illegal to consume, to purchase alcohol. An example of a movement that attracts a very specific kind of person, but where the issues are very broad, might be the Tea Party movement from a few years ago as well. And finally, a movement that has a very specialized or narrow set of issues, but attracts a large number or diversity of supporters is the Sunrise movement, which is concerned with climate change, which is still ongoing today. And so how do we see which type of movement is seen as more wonky and therefore more successful? Well, we conduct an experiment. And so the experiment basically has the following design. What we do is that we show a group of subjects, different versions of a Facebook page that supports a social movement that we kind of adapted. And so the movement that we chose is about banning animal testing. So this is kind of unethical, what some believe to be unethical animal testing in various different types of corporations. And basically what we did is that in addition to having subjects look at this Facebook page, we also manipulated different elements of this Facebook page. So not everyone got to see the same version of this Facebook page. Some people, for example, would see among the supporters of this movement a group of people that are very homogeneous in terms of identities, and then others would see a group of people that were very diverse in terms of their identities. In addition, what we also did is that we manipulated the text of what this movement was about. And so some folks saw text that signaled that this Ban Animal Testing Now group was also willing to acknowledge broader issues in society. And then some folks saw that this Ban Animal Testing group was very much focused on banning animal testing, specialized issues. And so we gathered 361 individuals to participate in this experiment. And after they saw these different versions of Facebook pages, which we randomly kind of gave out to the subjects in this experiment, what we did is that we asked them whether they wanted to donate some bit of the compensation that they would receive from participating in the experiment to the group that they just saw. So this is their own money. This is a real thing. We're not saying, would you donate? We actually asked them, will you actually donate? And then we'll take that money from what we're going to pay you. In addition, we also asked about their intentions. For example, if this were a real Facebook page, would you like the Facebook page? And in addition, how likely would you be to write to your elected official in support of the movement? So this is an external type of measure of success. Here were our results. And so when we compared different movements that were, let's say, broad in terms of the issues, as well as diverse in terms of supporters, that were broad in terms of issues, were homogeneous in terms of supporters, and specialized in terms of issues, and homogeneous in terms of identity, we saw that there was some movement on each one of these measures of success. But really, the type of movement that was most able to garner action from the subjects that we tested were those types of movements that in which we showed a diverse array of supporters, as well as focused on the narrow issue of banning animal testing. And so what we ultimately found basically was that this combination of having a diverse demographic of supporters, as well as a focused message, is ultimately what was most effective for this social movement and protest movement in terms of garnering support from bystanders or others who might not have otherwise been exposed to the movement. So the takeaway of this research, I think we can kind of bring back to this issue of Black Lives Matter. You know, back in 2017, 2018, there was a lot of press on Black Lives Matter, but in terms of public opinion, it actually didn't have a great deal of support. But we fast forward to this summer, and all of a sudden, there's a vast array of support coming from all different parts of the country for Black Lives Matter. So what's changed? And one kind of hypothesis for this is that the kinds of support for Black Lives Matter has become much more diverse, and public opinion has shifted with regard to that perceived change. And I think the lesson from this research is really that big tents are effective, but they're conditional on whether those big tents also have focused interests. And I think the other implication of this research is that we think of protests as being out on the streets. It's what makes the news. It's what's photographed by newspapers. But in reality, the underpinnings of what makes social protests successful today are in many cases their social media strategies. We know that social media is important for organizing protests, but I think what's also crucial for them is to think about how social media can also amass resources for them as well. So thank you so much for the opportunity. Happy to answer any other questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Wong. We are just about out of time, but there was one comment that came into the chat box, and it just says, to Wong, would you not add having a highly disruptive health event that starts in early spring with unemployment at 30 million, et cetera? Not being cynical, but just think that the choice to protest is among alternatives such as working or going to a restaurant.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I don't propose that I have an explanation that universally explains the difference between public support in 2017 for Black Lives Matter and 2020 for Black Lives Matter, which is why we actually decided to choose a type of social movement issue prior to the pandemic, was when we actually started this research that was we tested and figured out was not really ideologically aligned with one side or the other. But I fully agree with you that there are so many other factors that explain why people protest or don't protest. We're just talking about one of them here.
Thanks, Professor Wong. And with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Professor Akinola for closing remarks.
Thank you so much, Olivia, and to everybody. I know this 12 to 2 p.m. window is coveted with so many talks and so many things that you could be doing. So thank you to each of the presenters for sharing your wonderful work and for everyone who took the time to be here. Also, thank you to the Bernstein team, Shirley, Tracy, and Olivia, our MC, for all you did to put this together. And I can say for sure that I feel so inspired from this session. inspired to learn and engage more in this intellectually rich community at Columbia Business School, inspired to fundraise more for the Bernstein Center so that we can actually give out more grants and that support this fascinating research, and then also inspired to create more time for my own research because I miss it. So hope you too feel incredibly inspired and that you have a wonderful afternoon and rest of the day. Thank you.